be a question and answer afterwards.
Thank you, Tim.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it. Well, thank you for your attention. I'm not going to talk about me or my campaign. I'm going to talk about the oath and how important sovereignty is and states flexing their sovereignty to save the most precious thing, liberty. The true minority is the individual, not group rights, not extra rights, not special rights. That's going to be the focus of my talk. Over my 32-year career, I've had a front row seat watching all levels of government grow. Correspondingly, I have watched the citizens' freedom and rights shrink. The pace of government expansion has been incremental for most of my career, but since the Twin Towers Pentagon attacks on September 11th, 2001, it has accelerated. The administrative state, the Patriot Act, the NDAA, and now liberty-crushing response to COVID. The size of federal government today, and in particular the federal government, and the reach of its tentacles has so eclipsed the states that most people would have to look in a history book to know it was the states that gave birth to the federal government, not the other way around. Power is supposed to flow up from the people. Instead, we find ourselves covered by the weight of an intricate web of federal regulations and armed bureaucrats that justify their existence under the unobjectionable sounding banner of public safety. Public safety, yes. The federal government cares. They care so much about our public safety that the USDA has made armed raids of family farms for the crime of selling raw milk and organic vegetables. It is wise to question the motives and constitutionality of this level of intrusion in our lives. Government that seeks to remove all risks removes all rewards of liberty. The safety of the nanny state is a prison. They cared so much in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in 2005 that FEMA, with the help of duped local law enforcement, set a dangerous, unconstitutional precedent. Abandoning their oath, they disarmed law-abiding citizens, leaving them vulnerable to roaming bands of violent predators. The feds are in our backyards more and more. Much of the power and influence the federal government enjoys over the states has come through the repeated misuse of the Commerce Clause. The original intent of the Commerce Clause on the states was simply to regulate commerce with other nations, Indian tribes, and the respective states in the Union. But since FDR, there have been Supreme Court decisions expanding the meaning given to the Commerce Clause. It has become the primary source for regulatory expansion over the states, undoing the framers' original structure of limited and delegated powers. Let's dispense with a charade that the Supreme Court is independent or judicial. It is neither. It has become just another political and legislative branch of government, effectively a third chamber of Congress, except for the fact that its officials are unelected, operate in strict secrecy, and hold office for life, similar to the inner core of the Presidium in the communist USSR. The court's members no longer are there to judge, but to vote. Consequently, the federal government has jumped the guardrails and is drunk on power it was never delegated. Through intimidation, ignorance, and fear of losing federal funds, states comply rather than nullify unconstitutional regulations and acts, thereby surrendering the principle of balanced power known as dual sovereignty, where each part, federal and state, is sometimes superior and sometimes subordinate to the other. States do not have rights. Only citizens have rights. States have powers. When states do not assert the power reserved for them under the 10th Amendment against federal overreach, the citizen shrinks. The 10th Amendment was given to us as a rampart separating the states from federal tyranny. State sovereignty must be asserted for the proper balance of power between the states and federal government to be restored. James Madison said, "A healthy balance of power between the states and the federal government will reduce the risk of tyranny and abuse from either front." We have lost that balance of power. Dennis Prager said, "The bigger the government, the smaller the citizen." We are there. Thomas Jefferson warned, "When all government shall be drawn to Washington as a center of power, it will render powerless the checks provided and will become as venal," means corrupt, "and oppressive as the government from which we separated." We are there. When I consider the web of regulations and regulatory agencies spun over the states, one of the grievances in the Declaration of Independence resonates. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. We are there. The alphabet agencies of the administrative state lord over us, but do not fall within the enumerated powers granted in the Constitution. State government should be our strongest defense for the people against this federal overreach, but they have coalesced. Many so-called federal crimes are in fact regulatory violations, not laws. The standard of proof is often lower, and the fines and penalties are higher than state and federal crimes. Incredibly, in the Constitution, it only mentions 3 federal crimes: treason, piracy, and counterfeiting. But today, there are literally more federal laws and regulations than can be counted. It has been tried. There are so many that it seems we can be in violation of something at any given moment. Many of these laws are a duplication of state laws and are made in violation of the necessary and proper clause. Some are the product of Congress grandstanding on issues and putting their name on legislation, while others are made so that the federal government can step into local affairs and persecute rather than prosecute when they disagree with what a local jury or prosecutor did. Ayn Rand said, "The only power any government has is the power to crack down on criminals." Well, when there aren't enough criminals, one makes them. One declares so many things to be a crime that it becomes impossible for men to live without breaking laws. As you know, the 10th Amendment of the Bill of Rights reaffirmed that any power not explicitly granted to the federal government was explicitly withheld from the federal government. The Constitution is not a living document. Nonetheless, the federal government has become what Professor Edward Earle of UC San Bernardino describes as an administrative state. This is a system where administration and regulation replace politics as the ordinary means of making policy. The administrative state elevates the welfare of the collective over the rights and liberties of the true minority, the individual. The overreach of the administrative state is seldom challenged by state government because they depend on federal money, as Lieutenant Governor said. Idaho would take PILT money, payment in lieu of taxes. And that's the way for them to leverage, put our arm behind our back and make us go their way. Sometimes state officials cite the Supremacy Clause to their constituents as political cover for standing down to federal overreach when they should be standing up to it. The Supremacy Clause is not a federal trump card over the states. This misinformation over the meaning and scope of the Supremacy Clause has intoxicated federal bureaucrats with an attitude that they have absolute power over the states and has conditioned the people to believe the same when they do not see their state government flex and stand up jealously to federal overreach. Jealousy is the fear of losing something you love to someone else. Jealousy for liberty is the tenor we need in our elected representatives when it comes to state sovereignty and individual liberty. Alexander Hamilton made clear that when U.S. law is not pursuant to its constitutional, limited, and delegated powers, it will be merely a usurpation and will deserve to be treated as such. Certainly, the founders agreed that a supreme law was required for any proper government to function, but the federal government would be limited in its scope and supremacy to only the laws pursuant to the Constitution. Today, our state government is as venal as the federal government. Governor Little has crushed liberty by abusing power. He has been unchecked by the 44 subdivisions of the state known as counties. He declared a state of emergency without meeting the very high bar necessary for such action. Essential versus non-essential businesses, churches closed, in-person trial suspended. The Bill of Rights are the untouchables. And he and city mayors have stepped on the untouchables for almost 2 years now. I'm going to digress here for a moment and talk about the oath. The U.S. Constitution, Article 6, requires that all judicial, legislative, and executive officers of the state and federal government take an oath to support the Constitution. When that oath is not translated into action, in other words, when someone takes an oath and doesn't interpose between overreach and the people, it renders the Constitution toothless and government unrestrained. That's why we slid so much. That's why the citizen has shrunk and the government has grown. The oath must matter. Let's revisit where we were when Governor Little first stepped on the untouchables. Let's go back to the beginning of the hysteria and use the argument and the numbers from when the governor's first emergency order was issued in March of 2020. As of Easter 2020, there were 1,408 confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Idaho and ostensibly 27 related deaths. Idaho's population then was 1.79 million. Medical opinion at the time agreed there was a 98% chance of recovery. Focusing on known cases at the time, COVID affected 0.08% of our population and killed 0.002% of our residents. The numbers used to justify that we are in extreme peril were so far below the bar of common sense that it was self-evident we were not in the extreme peril standard required for the governor to exercise this extraordinary liberty-crushing authority under Idaho Code 46601, let alone extend it. Life is precious, and I do not make light of the heartbreak to loved ones lost from COVID-19. Nonetheless, where there is freedom, there is risk, and liberty must win over safety. Orders for the healthy to self-quarantine, closing churches, deciding which businesses are essential, requiring a face covering, suspending jury trials, and requiring specific distancing between people are unconstitutional under the 1st, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 14th Amendments of the Constitution for the United States. Our state constitution can be cited also for an equally strong argument. But the governor has the power, you say. Yes, Idaho Code 46601 authorizes the governor to have extraordinary authority only in times of extreme emergency. This is defined as the existence of extreme peril. Are we in peril now? No. Were we then? No. So suspend in your mind the 24/7 PSAs, public service announcements, that are echoing in your brain. Have we ever been in extreme peril from COVID? No. The risk of contamination and death were and are so minute that reason demands rejecting the false conclusion that Idahoans are in peril. On March 25th, 2020, when the governor's order to self-isolate came out, there were a 79 in 10,000 chance of catching COVID, a disease with a 98% recovery rate. A 20 in 1 million chance an Idahoan might die of COVID does not rise to the extreme peril requirement by any measure. I know of one elected official in Idaho's 44 counties who called the governor out on his overreach as unconstitutional. It was Adams County Prosecutor Boyd. He wrote a very, very compelling letter challenging the governor on his overreach, on his constitutional overreach. And of course, our lieutenant governor, she also challenged him. And there's, I think, Sheriff Wheeler up in North Idaho. But out of 44 counties, 3 voices that I know of that at least communicated concern and challenged the governor's action. So how do we begin to challenge overreach from federal and state governments and reclaim liberty in these times we're living in? There is an office uniquely suited to defend individual liberty from federal and state overreach: the county sheriff. When you think of the office of sheriff, you may not realize how uniquely suited it is to defend individual liberty and help restore state power. The sheriff is truly unique, one of a kind, unlike anything else. The sheriff is the only elected peace officer in the country. The sheriff does not answer to a bureaucrat in Washington, D.C., nor to the president, nor a judge, nor county commissioners, and not the governor. The sheriff answers to his boss, the people. By design, the sheriff is elected and close to the people, chosen to protect them from criminals of all stripes, including overreaching federal and state government. The sheriff is the people's guardian. In Mack Prince versus U.S., the Supreme Court reaffirmed the sheriff is the CLEO, the chief law enforcement officer in the county. This begs the question, why do we see so seldom sheriffs assert their authority by interposing their office between the people and federal or state overreach? Answer, like many of our elected officials, their oath has no meaning, and the office of sheriff has been compromised by ignorance and by dependence on federal money, mostly in the form of grants and gifts. The good news, there is a movement to restore the constitutional sheriff. Its aim is to remove the influences that compromise the office and replace it with conviction to the oath of office. Yes. Supporting this movement is the CSPOA, the Constitutional Sheriff Peace Officers Association. Their mission, to equip sheriffs, peace officers, and public officials with the necessary information and public support to carry out their duties in accordance with their oath of office. There are 3,100 sheriffs in the United States. Of these, 250 are members of the CSPOA. With your help, we'll make it 251. In addition, there are county commissioners and other officials that have joined and are backing their sheriffs. It would seem that these elected officials have asked an important question. Of what value is an oath when the person who takes it yields to the very forces it was intended to withstand? So, what does it look like when sheriffs are led by conviction to their oath? In Wyoming, sheriffs require that feds check in before making arrests, serving papers, or confiscating property. This policy came about after INS, now called ICE, raided the Castaneda family's home. The problem? The Castanedas were American citizens. The Wyoming Sheriff's policy will save lives and protect rights by providing much-needed oversight of federal actions in the states. Other examples of sheriffs standing up. In New York and Colorado, sheriffs refuse to enforce state gun control laws that are unconstitutional on their face. In New Mexico, the Sheriff's Association threatened to arrest feds who come to confiscate guns. Sheriff Johnny Brown in Ellis County, Texas, said he would resist any effort by the federal government to confiscate firearms in his county. Sheriff Brad Rogers of Elkhart, Indiana, told the FDA he would arrest their agents for trespass if they entered an Amish farmer's land to inspect without a search warrant. The feds threatened to arrest the sheriff. He did not flinch, but the feds slipped away, dropping the issue. Yeah. Sheriff Joe Baca in Sierra County, California, told his county commissioners he would not enforce Bureau of Land Management road closures in the National Forest. Sheriff Baca understands that sheriffs cannot be pressed into service to enforce federal regulations. When faced with such interposition by sheriffs, the federal government's response has been silent for the most part. It seems the feds find themselves in the untenable position of defending its practice of overreach against sobering constitutional realities and their own corpus of historical court precedents that favor dual sovereignty over federal tyranny and are clear that the feds have no constitutional basis of authority for law enforcement locally. To their dismay, the constitutional sheriffs are not going away, but are growing more numerous and bolder by standing by their oath. Let me be clear, this is not talk of revolution. The revolution has already taken place. It occurred incrementally over the last 60 years at least, and the citizen lost. What I am sharing is an avenue toward a peaceful restoration. But there is precious little time. The Marxists are sewing it up. If we still live in a constitutional republic, and if the rule of law still matters, there can be only one response to a legitimate challenge by a state to federal overreach: a shrinking federal footprint and citizens that stand taller. The same goes for state overreach in the counties. Otherwise, we are living under some other form of centralized government hidden behind the facade of a caring bloated administrative state where regulations penned by bureaucrats combined with executive orders have replaced the Constitution as the supreme law of the land. Obviously, there are consequences to standing on your oath to overreach, such as loss of funding and the potential of lengthy and costly legal battles. But for the right reasons, at the right time, and in the right measure, sheriffs are in a unique position to stand up as the guardian of the people and the state and U.S. constitutions. The alternative to standing up is for counties and states to submit to government's insatiable appetite for yet more power it was never delegated, thereby turning citizens to subjects. Whether to submit or restore, this is our decision to make now. Action cannot be left for the next generation. They have no frame of reference for the freedom stolen from them. We have a duty to posterity. May God bless Idaho and the Republic. Thank you.